I think I've been covering environmental justice and climate for a few years now to know that 15 minutes is not enough to talk about every aspect of the issue. But I'm going to go ahead and kick us off by stealing a line from the father of environmental justice himself, Dr. Bob Bullard. He once told me environmental justice is no longer a footnote, it's a headline. And that's really what we're here to talk about today with two environmental justice powerhouses, Dr. J and Catherine. So I'm going to go ahead, as you introduce yourselves, maybe I want you to talk about what are some ways in which you see environmental injustice play out in the real world, in your backyards, that many people may tend to ignore or gloss over, and something that needs fixing.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And just want to make sure that we start off by acknowledging the original caretakers of this land, because we know we would not be here if we were taking care of the earth the way that we should have. So when I think about that question, it is definitely personal. And there are so many injustices that we see, whether it's the fact that our weather is crazy, folks, again, having more asthma or any asthma, but there's also some injustices that can be invisible. And when I think about our work at the White House, particularly the Council on Environmental Quality and our Office of Environmental Justice, the injustices that we're trying to make visible are actually really dealing with access and accountability. So when you think about access, it's about being able to connect with folks that can make a difference, that can create decisions that can make your life better. And that's what we're trying to do in this administration. President Biden and Vice President have been so forward-leaning in making sure that we're building relationships with folks that have never had a relationship with the White House before. I also think about the access to resources, and that is primarily what we're trying to do through the Justice 40 initiative, making sure that 40% of the overall benefits of these investments are reaching disadvantaged communities. The second thing is accountability. There's not a community that I go to where someone doesn't ask me, how are you holding yourselves accountable at the White House? And that's an important question. And so when I think about the fact that we put out the first ever environmental justice scorecard to actually track how our federal agencies are advancing environmental justice or opportunities for improvement, that's major. Additionally, the fact that we put out, again, a new environmental justice executive order, which is an awesome document. But the one piece that I will bring up related to accountability is the fact that our agencies have to create an EJ strategic plan. And so it's not just going to be words on paper, but it's going to be something that we have to go back to and track and review and hold folks accountable.
And then Catherine?
Well, from my vantage point, for those that don't know me, I'm Catherine Coleman Flowers from Lowndes County, Alabama. So I take that with me wherever I go, and through that frame of reference, I look at what's happening in rural communities, and I look at what's happening in marginalized communities, and try to bring to the forefront their stories so people can actually see the injustice. Because I believe that these injustices have gone on for so long because people don't see them. And my issue that I've been involved with now for quite some time is a lack of access to sanitation. And people just assume, with Flint, the issue was the water being poisoned. But I think Flint was a milestone where we could also talk about the access to sanitation. And even here in Florida, I understand that some of the issues we've been talking about with failing septic systems, they're happening everywhere. But not only are septic systems failing, big pipe systems are failing. And it's failing more in marginalized communities. First and foremost, they're the canaries in the coal mine because of climate change. And also our economic paradigms oftentimes encourage these kinds of injustices. For an example, a lot of places, a lot of cities will put money and invest it in bringing a factory to an area and running infrastructure there and bypassing those communities that didn't have it, never got it, and can't advocate for it. So what we try to do is use storytelling to help people to see the injustices, so it helps the policymakers make better policies to make sure that these injustices don't continue. And I have to also say one of my roles is as the co-vice chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, where we get a chance to talk about these type of injustices that are taking place across the country and try to find some solutions.
No, I love that. And Catherine, I was hoping you can build on that a little bit more, because you mentioned Flint. We also saw the same thing happen in Jackson, I believe 2 years ago now. It's been 2 years. And there are several other cities that we're not talking about. I remember writing about Mobile, Alabama, and other cities, bigger cities like New York City and whatnot. But can you talk about just the current state of water infrastructure in America right now, and just kind of how this, as you mentioned, this historical legacy of injustice kind of plays a role in where investment is going, who's being impacted and whatnot. So if you could expand on that a little.
You know, I got a chance in November of last year to go to Jackson, Mississippi. And when I went there, I was fortunate enough to run into the mayor in the airport. And he said, Catherine, when you look at Jackson, what divestment creates. And it was very interesting because I went and I saw what was going on in Jackson firsthand. Some residents of the community took me around, explained their own trials and tribulations with the water issues in Jackson, the lack of water pressure. Sometimes they're afraid to drink the water. They gave me one example of when Deion Sanders was the coach of Jackson State University and all the people came to the homecoming, the water pressure went down because of the number of people that were in town. Just imagine living in a town and there's a homecoming game or a conference like this and the water pressure goes down. But when the next day I left and I went to Dubai. And when I went to Dubai and I looked at the history of Dubai, and Dubai is what could have been the black belt of the Middle East 60 years ago. But with divestment in Dubai, you're seeing a place that doesn't have a lot of water, but with divestment and innovation, they have become a destination. And the opposite with Jackson, and that is what the injustice looks like in this country, where it plays out over and over and over again, where people are not, where governments, and a lot of these problems are not on the federal level now. A lot of it is on the state and the local level, where they are ignoring communities that are poor, they're ignoring immigrant communities, they're ignoring rural communities, anyone they think do not have a voice. And the people that can afford to pay for the infrastructure get the government support, and the people that can't afford it don't get it. Those are the paradigms that we're trying to shift and change.
Now, speaking of water infrastructure, Detroit is also one of the major cities dealing with aging water infrastructure among many environmental justice issues. It's also one of the cities that are hit hard by the climate crisis. Now, Dr. J, you're from Detroit, and you've had your own personal experience of flooding there too. So how does it feel like to face this where you grew up, and from a policymaker's standpoint now, how do you see these issues being addressed?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to appreciate Ms. Catherine for all of her advocacy and brilliance and serving on our White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Thank you. I will say water is something that's really important. I grew up in the Great Lakes, and we had access to fresh water, and I just kind of took it for granted. But then you see the flip side, where in Detroit, you have folks that can't afford water. In Flint, you had the crisis of many crises across this country. And then you have the crisis that's brought on by extreme flooding. And so my parents, who live on the east side of Detroit, unfortunately experienced 5 floods in 2 years. And these were floods that you had water rising in their basement, where you lost family Bibles. And every time it rains, they still get scared because of that trauma, because of basically infrastructure that is just not up to date. And the lack of accountability by, in many ways, city and county governments. So when I think about the opportunity that this administration has to rectify that problem, not only for my parents, but for folks across this country, I am excited and hopeful. When I think about the monies through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act that folks talked about yesterday, there's $55 billion that we are putting out there to make sure that clean water is delivered to communities across this country. 799 million just here in the state of Florida. So I have hope, again, that this administration has elevated environmental justice to a level that it's never been. They are actually seeing people and hearing people, and we're going to make progress. So that is what keeps me excited and hopeful, particularly on the waterfront. So folks like my parents won't have to deal with this repeated trauma ever again.
Well, thank you both. I'm looking at the time, and there's so much to talk about. That's why I was like, 15 minutes is not enough. So I'm going to combine both these questions since it's sort of related. But across the country, we have seen environmental and civil rights protections being rolled back and challenged. We've heard that some court rulings have been disheartening for some advocates. Catherine, what have you been hearing on the ground? What are your thoughts on this? And for you, Dr. Jalonne, I understand that you can't speak to any pending litigation, so I won't ask you to do that. So instead, just recognizing the currently polarized landscape, I'd like to ask about some of the efforts, solution-wise, that the federal government is continuing to pursue to advance environmental protection and environmental justice today.
Well, I'll start by saying that the U.S. Department of Justice took as its first case using Title VI to deal with the environmental justice, a complaint that we filed with Earth Justice against the Alabama Department of the Alabama Department of Public Health. When we did our parasite study and found evidence of hookworm in people in Lowndes County, Alabama, using PCR technology, they put on their website that it was not a valid study because we used PCR technology. And we filed that complaint, and that complaint was investigated by HHS and DOJ. And that was the first time that had ever happened in history where Title VI was used in this country to deal with environmental justice. And the first settlement was announced a year ago. We've also, using other methods that are in place now, the US EPA has an Office of External Civil Rights and Environmental Justice, and we've since filed another complaint against the state agency that will probably set up a potential challenge to determine whether or not Title VI can continue to be used for environmental justice. So we're just using all of the avenues that are available, whether it's through policy, whether it's through local advocacy, or whether it's working with the administration to make sure that environmental justice is at the forefront. At least we set some precedents where it will not be business as usual in these communities.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't want to shortchange the fact that this administration created the first Office of Environmental Justice ever. So that is something that we cannot take for granted.
Absolutely.
So for me, when I think about our goals as an office, one is to make sure that we're reducing burdens and harm on communities of color and low-income communities. The second is to make sure that we're delivering those resources to those same communities. And the third, and probably maybe one of the most important things, is to make sure that environmental justice is institutionalized across the White House and all of our federal agency partners. Because when you talk about environmental justice, this is a moment, but I don't want it to just be a moment. Right. I think about when I'm gone. I think about when, again, if the political winds were to shift, how I want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to make sure environmental justice is embedded in the fabric and foundation of the White House and the federal government. So there's a lot of things that our federal agency partners are doing to make sure that it sticks, that you might not see on the outside. But when you talk about changing your practice, changing your policies, changing your incentive structures, all these pieces that are going to make sure environmental justice is not just a word or the flavor of the week. And so that's what we are focused on right now. So all of the pieces of President Biden's ambitious environmental justice agenda, all of our initiatives and great things that we're doing, that's awesome. And we're trying to make sure that what we're doing now is going to make it durable, it's going to be sustainable, and that people, again, will be able to see the differences not just now, but years and decades from now. Because I remind myself and I remind my staff, what we're doing here is not about us. It's about the folks that we know and the folks that we don't know. And so I am truly, again, just blessed and privileged to be a part of this administration that gets it. And I hope people will realize that and see the difference that we're trying to make.
And that is a good note to end on. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Catherine, Dr. Day.